So, hello everyone, and thank you very much for being here today with us for our 16th series of e-YEG presentations. Today we have two excellent invited presentation and speakers from the Australasia region. We have Dr. Fred Baines and Mr. Steve Parry. We're going to talk about the guidelines for the development and application of engineering geological models on projects. And I have to admit that as I have been a part of it, this is like a project that runs many years, and I anticipate that is really important information for most of the people. So let's go directly to the presentation. Some few words for our first speaker. Dr. Fred Baines was educated in the UK and immigrated to Australia in 1980, where he is an independent consultant engineering geologist. He provides advice to major projects in the civil, mining, and oil and gas sectors throughout the world and advocates focusing on field studies and developing effective engineering geological models to facilitate project delivery. He teaches courses on engineering geology and geology for engineers and was president of the International Association of Engineering Geology from 2007 to 2010. He's currently the chair of the IAG Commission 25, who is responsible for today's lecture. Thank you very much, Fred, for being here. It's time to start the presentation. We're going to have some minutes after the first and the second presentation for some questions that you may have. So please pose the questions in the chat, and the speakers are going to be able, in order for the speakers to be able to answer those questions after the presentation. I assume that now it's time to move on.
Well, good day to you, wherever you are around the world. I am delighted and honoured to give this webinar to the young engineering geologists Stratis, that's not working. The sound's gone.
Sorry for that.
Had their origin in a meeting in Jeju in South Korea in 2019, when C25, the group agreed that we needed to develop some guidelines. So myself and Steve Parry proceeded to develop these guidelines, and we did it by collecting the thoughts and ideas from a whole series of people around the world who are listed here. And we are extremely grateful for the enormous contribution that they made. After having harvested these ideas, we tried to consolidate them into one working document. And this document now consists of advisory clauses, which say how you should develop an engineering geological model, and then commentary, which gives further advice on each of the advisory clauses. And then there are a series of examples of engineering geological models provided by some experts from around the world. The guidelines include some definitions of the different types of model and how they interrelate. They provide the fundamental principles which underlie the way that the guidelines need to be adopted. But more than anything else, the guidelines provide a development methodology. And what I mean by that is that they are an explanation in practical terms of how you develop an engineering geological model and apply the guidelines. There are lots of diagrams to illustrate the workflow and thinking processes, and these guidelines are applicable around the world on all different scales of projects, from major infrastructure projects to single-story dwellings. And they're also currently being translated into Chinese, Portuguese, and Spanish, and we're hoping that within the next few months we will have versions of the guidelines in these languages downloadable from the e-YEG website. Now, this is an overarching process diagram that indicates the way that the engineering geological model operates. And the engineering geological model actually consists of a comprehensive knowledge framework. This is indicated by this red bounding box. And this knowledge framework allows the logical evaluation and interpretation of the geological, geomorphological, and hydrological conditions that could impact a project. Importantly, the EGM comprises both conceptual and observational components, and it may consist of a series of interrelated models and approaches that all work together to develop this knowledge framework. The purpose of the guidelines is to provide authoritative advice on what constitutes best practice for the effective use of engineering geological models in a wide range of applications. Now, this yellow box, which is the EGM building process, includes a conceptual component which really reflects your understanding of the geology, geomorphology, and hydrogeology at any stage of the project, and an observational component which consists of the information, the observations that are required during investigations. And you can see that the proportions of concepts and observations change as the project progresses. Now, the outputs from the engineering geological model building process are basically the deliverables of any project. So this is the information that you get paid to produce. So it's extremely important. And what we've tried to do is to systematize what that information should consist of. And fundamentally, you need to differentiate the factual and interpretive content of your reports. And then those reports consist of a geological model, which should indicate the distribution in 3D space of the engineering geological units, the hydrogeological conditions, and the geological and geomorphological processes. There is then a geotechnical model, which provides the engineering characteristics of all of the components of the geological model. And there should also be a geohazard assessment, which should be an assessment of any geological and geomorphological processes or phenomena that could adversely impact the project, such as landslides or karst development. Now, the principles that underlie the engineering geological model is that, firstly and foremost, the EGM is a knowledge framework. The EGM is not a simple visualization within a computer. It is a knowledge framework of all of this information. And that knowledge framework is used to evaluate the interactions between the project and the ground. You can't have an EGM without a project and all of the engineering that's associated with that project. And I would argue that you can't have a successful project without an EGM to help you make sound decisions. The EGM comprises conceptual ideas and observational data, which are separate kinds of information. The EGM needs to be developed for all projects. It doesn't really matter how big or how small the project is, you still need a knowledge framework to make good engineering decisions. The EGM is relevant throughout the project life cycle. It's not just restricted to the investigation. The EGM is useful during the design, during construction, during operation, and even during decommissioning. And knowledge of both geology and engineering is required to develop an EGM. There is absolutely no point in understanding the geology if you don't understand the significant parts of the geology to the engineering decision making. Now, this is another process diagram which shows how the model building process operates. And what this actually is the application of the scientific method in which you generate a hypothesis, which is the model, then you test it by carrying out some investigations, and then you prove or improve your hypothesis as you collect information. So it is the model building process that drives the collection of information. And this involves conceptualization and then anticipation of what might be in the ground, which, when it's combined with knowledge of what the project engineering involves, will lead to questions regarding critical aspects of the geology that could affect the engineering. Those questions are answered by the cost-effective collection of sufficient information to make good engineering decisions. So when you're carrying out investigations, there has to be a limit to the amount of money that you can spend and the amount of time that you can spend collecting that information. And that has to be arrived at when you've got sufficient information to answer most of the important questions. And any other questions can be treated as residual risks. This process of answering questions can also occur as you go through design and construction. You can collect further information which will help you build the engineering geological model. Importantly, this area in green, which is where you are reporting the results of your endeavors, this should only occur when the observations are compatible with the concepts and the questions have largely been answered. And this little control needs to be discussed in some further detail. So the conceptual component of your EGM is what you think is there. The observational component of your EGM is what you found during the investigations. And in this little yellow cloud is the critical question: are the observations compatible with the concepts? If they're not, you really need to go back and start comparing what you think is in the ground with what you've found during the investigations. But if they are compatible, then it is reasonable to proceed to engineering analysis. So you should only proceed to engineering analysis when compatibility is achieved and you have a good understanding of the knowledge framework at any stage of the project. So something that I see time and time again is when people have proceeded to very sophisticated, expensive engineering analysis when they just do not understand the geological and geomorphological conditions. And so they basically put garbage into an analysis and the result is that they produced garbage out of the analysis. This is a waste of time and money for the project. Because what you're trying to do as you go through the various stages of investigation, design, construction, and operation is to use the engineering geological model to make sure that as you proceed, you are increasing the reliability of the engineering. As you increase the reliability of the engineering, you reduce the risks and you reduce the uncertainty. And this is the way to lead to project success. Now, this is a very, very complicated overarching diagram, and it's got many, many different details. So I think it's important to appreciate that the EGM can be developed at a variety of levels. So within the guidelines, we've produced this simple matrix in which we've got project complexity, which varies from very, very minor, small footprint, low consequence projects to major infrastructure with high consequences of failure. And then we can think of these being built in very, very uniform, geotechnically simple ground to very complicated, hazardous geotechnical conditions. And the result of this is that you can have different levels of development of the EGM, so that for a level 1 development, there's really not that much involved. There'll be a small site visit, there might be some subsurface investigations, there may not be any laboratory testing, and it can be documented in a very simple report, as opposed to a level 3 investigation, for instance, which is going to be millions of dollars of work, lots of different tasks, multi-stage investigations, specialized laboratory testing, documentation of the EGM, and probably 3D digital visualizations. And it will be driven by a large multidisciplinary group. Now, within these development levels, there's also an important review function. And what we're saying is that for a level 1 development, probably internal review is perfectly satisfactory. For a level 2 development, it might be a combination of internal and external peer review. But for a level 3 development, it will certainly require external review, and it may require a panel of experts to review the project. Now, this idea of there being a scope of work which is defined by the development level is also presented within the guidelines as this example brief for consultants to follow when they're documenting the various components of an EGM that they've been developed. So fundamentally, you have to state what the development level is, and then there's the conventional separation of a factual report and an interpretive report. The interpretive report will present the findings of the desk study, a conceptual model, the rationale for the site investigation, the engineering geological units, the geological model, the geotechnical model, then maps, plans, and sections to illustrate the different models, a geohazard assessment if needed, and a 3D digital model report if that's been required. Now, this list really applies clearly to large projects, but it applies equally to small projects when each of these items could probably be described in a single paragraph and the entire documentation could be presented in one brief 1 or 2 page report. So the guidelines, I stress, apply from everything from very large to very small projects. Finally, there is a checklist, which is really there for the project manager to use to make sure that they understand how the project is developing, whether the various tasks required have been completed, and where the various deliverables that are required have been developed. And in all of this, I think that it's really important that maps and sections are provided to illustrate the engineering geological conditions. And that finally, the review function of the engineering geological model at a suitable level by a suitable experienced engineering geologist is essential to ensuring the quality of the EGM. I'd like to now describe a little case history, which involves a power station that was constructed in the 1930s involving a surface penstock. And this area here presented some cause for concern. This is a photograph taken during construction, and the geology of the area is that the lower slopes are underlain by sandstones and dolerites, and then the upper slopes are underlain by layered basalts. And in this area here, there's a suspicious flat developed on the slope, and there have been movements of this anchor block here. This is a LiDAR image of the same area, and you can quite clearly see that flat where it affects the penstocks. But there's also some interesting evidence of other potential instability in this image. This is a conceptual model that was developed probably about 40 years ago, which shows the underlying geology. There, the basalts, here the sandstones, and here the dolerites. And there are existing landslides that are observed on the surface. And then there's this suspicious area where this anchor block S moved, which might be formed by a massive ancient landslide. This is a conceptual model. This is what I thought might be there. So it's then important to start thinking about what are these basalt flows likely to be like. And basalt flows are developed along drainage lines, and they usually accumulate over layers of alluvium and lacustrine deposits where the drainage has been blocked by the basalts. So in these kinds of environments, you tend to get weathering of the basic igneous rocks and of tuffs and of volcanic ashes. Now, in conditions of poor drainage, where you've got lots of calcium and magnesium, which can be derived from the pyroxene and plagioclase in basalt, which are both rich in calcium and magnesium, these are likely to produce clay minerals of a distinctive form. So the most likely clay minerals to develop in these circumstances are the smectites, where there are lots of cations and anions that are located between the lattices of aluminosilicates. Now, the important thing about smectites is that these formed clays of high plasticity, which have got liquid limits in the range of 60 to 100%. So these are significantly plastic clays, high plasticity clays. If you look at what kind of characteristics these might have, then this diagram suggests that for liquid limits of around maybe 40 to 100, you're likely to have residual angles of shearing resistance of between 10 and 20 degrees. If you look at some of the surfaces that are developed in these sediments, specifically the lacustrine clays, which in themselves tend to be persistent, you've got these highly polished sheared surfaces, which are almost certainly at their residual angles of shearing resistance. So this allows you to produce another conceptual model of what you might find in layers of basalt. So the layers of basalt are going to be characterized by being strongly developed aquifers, and they may have been deposited over lacustrine and alluvial sediments, which may have polished and slicken-sided shear surfaces. So it's likely that there are persistent horizontal layers beneath the basalt with residual angles of shearing resistance of between 10 and 20 degrees. And this whole condition is likely to produce deep-seated instability on slopes that are underlain by basalt in this condition. As part of this study, some engineering geological mapping was carried out. And this is an absolutely essential component of any engineering geological model. And what I've done here is what's called total engineering geological mapping, which involves indicating what the bedrock conditions are, what the superficial deposits are, what the geomorphological conditions are. And this total geological engineering geological map has been used to understand what risks that could be presented to the penstock. And in this case, the risk or the hazard is one of this old area, which could be an old landslide. What would happen if it moved and ruptured the penstocks? So all of this information, all of the mapping, the analysis, the testing, the laboratory testing, the LiDAR, the borehole data, can all be presented in an observational model. So the observational model is based on the concepts, but it's now constrained by actual site investigation data. The stratigraphy of the basalt is clearly shown. The layer of weak tufaceous sediments is indicated. The groundwater levels are shown. And the geomorphological expression of the landslides is indicated in this area here. This area is the penstock block that moved, and it moved tens of millimeters when it was during the 1970s. At that time, it wasn't known whether the landslide movements were due to insufficient mass of the penstock block being unable to resist the thrust of the penstock, or whether it was landslide movements. This model suggests that it could be landslide movement, but it is still a model that tries to predict what might happen in the future. And this forms the basis of a risk assessment. So the documentation of the engineering geological model is used to carry out a risk assessment for that study. And this involved understanding a variety of different scenarios, ranging from a small landslide incident that caused a small outage to a major landslide incident that ruptured the penstocks completely and caused a failure of the entire system and disrupted the power station building. And the annual probabilities of these different events were assessed, and then the cost of each scenario was evaluated, and then using the annual probabilities, the estimated economic annual cost was developed. So this was how the engineering geological model was used to underpin a risk assessment, which ultimately allowed some considered engineering decisions to be made about this particular project. Now, I'd now like to talk about how the EGM works in a digital environment. And it's important to note that not all EGMs need a digital environment to be developed in. Many projects around the world can be simply assessed using a pencil and paper, using maps and sections. They don't need a digital environment. However, when there are large amounts of information involved that need to be built into the engineering geological model building process, processing and collating that large amount of information is very conveniently done in a digital environment. Furthermore, when you are documenting and reporting all of that information, it is also sometimes very convenient to communicate and document that information within a digital environment. So fundamentally, the EGM has to be collated, interpreted, documented, and communicated. And that's still it's still carried out by using maps, sections, and reports. But when you're working in a digital environment, the maps are produced within a geographic information system, and this is an extremely convenient and useful way of processing the information. And then all of this information can also be processed in a digital environment so that 3D models can be produced of all of the information, and they can be presented and interrogated and understood within this environment. Now, the guidelines provide some extremely important guidance on how to best carry out these processes. Fundamentally, whatever you're doing, the work has to be informed by a conceptual model of the site, what you understand to be the geological and geomorphological conditions. The software is then used for data collation, processing, and interpretation. So the choice of software and the functionality that you need is an important decision. And obviously, there's a cost implication involved here. The more functionality that you require, the greater the cost of the software. But the other thing that the guidelines provide is commentary on process control to ensure quality and integrity during the modeling process. And finally, there is quite some important guidance on the outputs that you provide, including the need for illustrative maps and sections and the way that the 3D surfaces should be presented. The different kinds of models consist of explicit models, which are the traditional wireframed interpretation, and these are manually constructed surface. This model here is of the foundation conditions of a large concrete gravity dam. There's a variety of platforms that are available with a wide range of functionality. But in this explicit models, the interpretation is controlled by the modeler, and it may not be reproducible by another modeler. These kinds of models are possibly suited to smaller data sets or limited project extents, and they can be time consuming to edit or update when you've got new data. These compare with implicit models, where implicit models use algorithms to interpolate between the observations, and the interpretation is a function of both the algorithms and the modeler. They have the ability to rapidly build and analyze multiple scenarios, and they're suited to larger data sets and possibly to regional studies. They can be automatically updated as further information is acquired. And it's possible that you can it's possible to reproduce multiple models. However, providing an audit trail and independently reproducing an interpretation may be problematic. But the guidelines provide some important advice as to how you can document the different processes that you're going through when you create these different models. But importantly, I think you need to produce illustrative maps and cross sections, because often 3D models can be opaque. If you can't operate or explore the particular software environment, then it's not possible to go into the model and understand how it works. So the people producing the model need to illustrate it with maps and cross sections. But furthermore, you need to have a 3D digital model report to document the way that the decisions have been made around the model that has been created. So, some concluding remarks. These guidelines document best practice in engineering geology. I'd like you to consider downloading the document and using or adopting the guidelines in your practice or your research. If we can adopt these guidelines, we can improve our engineering geological models, we can improve practice, and we can improve project success rates. Conversely, if you think the guidelines themselves could be improved, then please contact us and become involved. This is very much a live document, and we do need the input of YEG members, because you're the people who are most knowledgeable about this evolving study of digital model development. The other thing that you could do is consider translating the guidelines into your language or discussing them within your national groups. And we would be delighted to help you if you would like to do that. So thank you very much indeed for attending this webinar, and I hope that this presentation has given you some insights into the way that these guidelines can be used. Thank you.
So that was a very interesting presentation, and we have already some questions. So I would like to ask from Fred to turn on his camera and his microphone. Probably he would start answering your questions. So if some of you have more questions, please go ahead. And Fred, you can see also the questions, but let's start with the first one. We have one participant asking, since this is an international publication, he wants to ask if the idea of the engineering geological models was well established among the participants at the beginning of the work. I know that this is a tedious work since many years, but.
Sorry, the question is, did people really understand the whole concept throughout the world?
That's what I'm getting also, yeah.
Yeah, my view is that everybody was well aware of the use of geological models, but perhaps the idea that you could develop guidelines and systematize the whole process wasn't fully aware, but and that's really the process that occurred, was harvesting all of these different ideas as to how people thought it might work and bringing it together into one consolidated document. So it has been a 3-year journey during which I guess we've all learned an awful lot about how we might do this.
I know. So next question is about the case that you showcased. So is the landslide creeping gradually or abrupt event on the case study of power station? It looks like from picture vegetation is preserved well.
The landslide itself, well, we're not actually sure that it's a landslide. That's our hypothesis. The landslide is occasionally moving during extreme weather events, but most of the time it doesn't move, and so there has been some surface drainage installed to improve well, to improve the drainage, and that may or may not be effective. We don't really know. It's a classic example of the situation is being monitored, and there's a risk assessment and an emergency plan to deal with movements if they were to occur.
Next question is, can you tell us how the event probabilities were obtained, the case history of a landslide endangered the pipelines?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
The question goes like, can you tell us how the event probabilities were obtained, probably for this landslide? And
yeah, it was done in a risk workshop where a group of 4 or 5 experts discussed they developed event trees to understand what the different conditional probabilities would be involved in the development of each scenario, and then the group of experts discussed what might be reasonable probabilities for each part of the event tree, and they were built up like that. This is a pretty common practice, and it involves a great deal of interaction between people of different disciplines as to what might be reasonable probabilities of triggering events or movements, or if this happens, would that happen, and how likely is that to happen? So that, for instance, you've got to have knowledge of how the landslide might operate, but you've also got to have knowledge of how a penstock might respond to movements, and how far can you move a penstock before it ruptures?
So next question is quite interesting and probably could be like the next step. Is there a suitable comprehensive software that can help to develop engineering geological models?
There are a variety of softwares, and we've been very careful in producing the guidelines not to mention any of the different kinds of software, because we do not want to be associated with one proprietary method. And also, these things come and go. What might be the most useful piece of software now will probably not be the most useful piece of software even 3 or 4 years from now. But what we have tried to do is to concentrate on the kinds of functionalities that you actually need to use in the different software, so that each group is going to choose a piece of software that is suited to the projects. They need to think about the functionalities required, the size of the data sets that are going to be needed, and also their ability to learn how to drive the software. These things aren't particularly easy to learn to drive, and it's only when you can drive them proficiently that you can use them effectively.
I agree on that. Next question is, how can we deal with biased judgment and quantify uncertainties involved in engineering geological models?
Wow. Well, that is dealt with within the guidelines, and I haven't even touched upon it here, but there's 2 types of uncertainty. There's uncertainty associated with the observations, which you can actually deal with largely statistically.
Yeah.
These are the statistics of observations that you've got. But the uncertainty associated with the conceptual component of the model is far more difficult, because it's someone's view as to what is a reasonable interpretation, and we're of the view that is best dealt with by review by expert panels or by internal review. So in other words, to understand the uncertainty in the conceptual component, you really need review by someone with experience in that geological environment, or a group of people with experience in that geological environment, who can look at it and ask themselves the question, does this really make sense, or has this person gone off at a tangent and has maybe missed the main issue here, which often happens. People go down rabbit holes when they're trying to do an interpretation and they never get out of them.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question. Is there a part of the guideline or a particular point that is particularly relevant to get the uniform party involved? I'm not sure.
To get the what?
I'm not sure. Is there a part of the guidelines or a particular point relevant to get the uninformed party involved? Probably the people that are not informed. I'm not sure.
Well, I'm not quite sure what the question is, but
yeah,
perhaps I could just comment that
sure.
really you have to think of the guidelines as being a cohesive document that really applies right the way through. So I think that there's no single part of the guidelines which is a fundamental point. It's more the overall application of the entire document that is important.
Nice. I think there are going to be more questions also. I'm sure that there are going to be. Let's go to another question and we can move on, and probably we can have a better QA later on. So is there any engineering geological model integrated with machine learning or deep learning algorithm at your knowledge?
Oh God.
Well, it's a big trend lately. So yeah.
So associated with deep learning or presumably we're talking about artificial intelligence and those kinds of things. I don't think that we've got to that stage yet, and I personally don't think that we'll ever get to that stage. I really do believe that all of these software applications are tools that need to be used by people to better understand the information that they have at their hands.
And yeah, one of our participants mentioned that there is already some geological ground models such as MapTech, but yeah, it's a big conversation that can start with that. Let's go to the last question and we can move to Steve's presentation. One of the challenges in industry is convincing our clients of just how important developing such models are in terms of early project de-risking and investment. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, one of the ways that we could develop this is to think of those development levels, the 3 development levels, and then actually try and collect information as to what typical costs and times are involved for we might conclude that a development level 1 typically costs $20,000 and a development level 3 typically costs $5 million. And I think that kind of advice early on in a project, that for this kind of project, you're looking at this kind of expenditure to produce this kind of engineering geological model, would be very useful, because you can then work out what the cost will be with the benefits to the project of progressively reducing the risks as you go through the process. So I think that is very much what I would like to see is the guidelines used to communicate between practitioners and owners and regulators, so that we all appreciate how important it is at an early stage of the project to start developing effective engineering geological model knowledge frameworks.
I think it's time to move to the next presentation. We can have like more detailed QA later on. So thank you very much, Fred, for your presentation. It was really informative in general. So A little bit, some words for our next speaker. Steve Parry is an independent consulting engineering geologist. He spent 23 years in Hong Kong, first with the Hong Kong government and then running his own consultancy. He returned to the UK in 2013 and provides advice to a wide range of projects, both in the UK and overseas, as well as acting as expert witness. He was chair of IAG Commission C25 from 2010 to 2020. Steve also teaches on the Master of Science in Engineering Geology at Leeds University, UK, focusing on field skills, including engineering, geomorphological mapping, and landslide hazard and risk assessment. We're ready for his presentation.
So, following on from Fred's presentation, I now want to talk about the process of conceptualization and how that fits into engineering geological models. Fred has already introduced this figure, and you can see the conceptualization process commences at the beginning of the project. The guidelines define a conceptual model as being based on engineering geological concepts and interpretations, and the knowledge that certain engineering geological conditions and processes are likely to have certain engineering characteristics, i.e., when undertaken correctly, it allows for the anticipation of the possible ground conditions that could affect a project. The conceptual component is undertaken at the start of the project, but provides the framework for the assessment of the EGM throughout the project lifecycle. The techniques involved in developing conceptual models and observational models are fundamentally different. The first involves the act of conceptualization, and the second involves the act of evaluating data and assembling the information. As such, they form two different but essential and complementary tools that must be combined at all stages of the project to develop appropriate EGMs. The figure shows a conceptual model and an observation model for the assessment for the extension of a sand and gravel quarry, which involved dewatering and the assessment of settlement. There was no existing model with the operator simply focused on mineral and overburden. Yet the geological history of the site is complex, resulting in considerable geotechnical variation across the site.
Outputs from conceptual models can be site-specific, generic, or temporal. Site-specific outputs provide a framework for the interpretation of the observational data and allow anticipation of the ground conditions that may be present at the project site. Generic are independent of the specific location and provide, for example, information on overall climatic or structural geological settings. Temporal models illustrate how ground conditions have evolved over geological time.
Conceptualization is a process whereby all available information is considered and an understanding is developed of what the ground conditions at the site are likely to be and how they developed over time. It is not a desk study, although one is required. Conceptualization should start at the project commencement, but it should be reviewed as additional information is required. The conceptual approach generates hypothetical models, and as such, potentially they involve a relatively high degree of uncertainty. That's directly related to the type and amount of existing data, but more importantly, the knowledge and experience of those involved.
At this site, the warehouses were showing signs of distress and localized areas of collapse had occurred. The site is located in a former coal mining area with both shallow and deep extraction. Nearby existing ground investigations showed the presence of peat, and historical maps showed the presence of both former ponds and surface gravel extraction. The conceptual model evaluated all the possible causes and identified the various hazards and risks to the existing structures. This identified shallow coal workings with the hazard of subsidence due to the collapse of the workings, as well as differential settlement due to the former ponds as being the highest risk. A moderate risk from the collapse of the former shafts was also identified. The uncertainties in the model were stated and future tasks identified to reduce these.
During conceptualization, the following key aspects of the site should be considered: project setting, the stratigraphy, the geological structure, and surface and subsurface processes, both active and relict. Project setting. This should be based on an appreciation of the overall tectonic setting and regional geology project location, the current, past, and potential future climatic settings of the project location, and the wider site setting. For example, the evaluation of landslide hazards originating outside the site area. The inset picture shows a landslide which resulted in a train derailment. Nobody was hurt, but the cost of the insurance claim was over £2 million. Whilst the rail operator had evaluated landslide risk associated with its land, i.e. cuttings and embankments, landslides beyond this were not considered. Stratigraphy. This requires an understanding of the rock, soil forming and rock, soil modifying processes in the project area. A fundamental strategy in developing the conceptual framework is that there should be an understanding of the total geological history of the site based on Fuchs et al. 2000. This states that the ground conditions at any site are a product of its total geological and geomorphological history, which includes stratigraphy, the structure, the former and current geomorphological processes, and the past and present climatic conditions. The total geological history is responsible for the mass and material characteristics of the ground. This information is most commonly extracted from the legend of geological maps, which are the fundamental building blocks of engineering geological models. The geological maps indicate the rock type present and their ages. This enables environments of formation to be evaluated, which allows estimates of geological variability in terms of rock type, extent, thickness, and form. The information on age allows an evaluation of the subsequent modification since formation in terms of processes such as tectonics and weathering. The site is located in a valley. The main rock type is sandstone of Silurian age, overlain by Quaternary glacial till. There's an intrusion of dolerite. There are faults in the area and the bedding dips steeply. Using the geological map, a site reconnaissance, and a depth study, a conceptual model of the site was generated to evaluate the possible ground conditions that may be present, influencing the hydrogeology of the site. These include, for the solid geology, discontinuities, possible interbeds in the sandstone, the impact of faults and intrusions, and variable weathering. For the superficial deposits, these include fluvial glacial deposits, buried valleys, eskers, varying till types, and glacial shears. Geological structure. In addition to lithology, an understanding of boundary conditions is critical to the development of good engineering geological models. Bounding surfaces can take many forms, including bedding planes, joints, faults, unconformities, igneous contacts, etc. Each type of boundary is associated with a different modifying geological condition and results in distinct variations in geotechnical parameters. There's a need to understand their origin, geometry, spacing, extent, characteristic features, and their engineering significance. Surface and subsurface processes. This requires knowledge and experience of both geology and geomorphology to evaluate what processes may have occurred in the past, as well as what processes are active or could be reactivated by the project. I want to now present an example of the conceptualization process. This was developed for teaching purposes, and for further details refer to Baines et al. In QJEG 2021. The project involves a hypothetical 1 meter diameter pipeline traversing the site from northeast to southwest. The site set in Yorkshire. It's a south-facing slope. There's a major river to the south and an east-west trending valley. Note, there is no development on the site. The geological map shows a site to be underlain by lower coal measures of Carboniferous age. These comprise alternating sandstone and mudstones, as well as coal bands. As such, the concept of cyclic sedimentation is relevant. The bedding dips gently to the southwest. There are northwest and east-west trending faults. The site's been glaciated with extensional till map. There's also a mapped landslide associated with the site. Our geological knowledge tells us that coals are developed in a cycle of sediments, which typically include clays or sea turfs below the coal, which in turn are underlain by sandstone. The cyclic sedimentation concept has geotechnical significance because the sea turfs are often fissured clay. Any tectonic deformation of the coal measure strata can result in flexural slip and interbed shearing. Consequently, sea turf clays can be reduced down to residual strength. The site has been affected by both quaternary glacial and periglacial processes. Periglacial processes particularly affect south-facing slopes. The published literature also suggests multi-phases of activation and reactivation of landslide processes. The site is also underlain by coal seams, which may have been worked and therefore are potentially associated with various hazards for the project, such as settlement, crown hole collapse, and shaft collapse.
Following conceptualization, each geological factor potentially present at the site should be assessed with respect to their possible hazards to that particular project. To aid communication of the conceptual model, visualizations are invaluable. However, a visualization on its own is not a conceptual model. In this example, possible geotechnical properties for the varying engineering geological units are also listed. The conceptual model also allows the generation of initial risk registers, where risk is likelihood times consequences, shown here in a qualitative risk matrix. For each engineering geological issue identified by the conceptual model, an evaluation of likelihood and consequence is made to generate a risk. In this example, deep-seated active landslides are the highest risk, with catastrophic failure of the pipeline possible if they are present on the site. In this example, the evaluated levels of risk have been taken and incorporated back into the visualization of the conceptual model. Finally, I want to show a couple of case studies to illustrate the use of conceptual models on actual projects. First case study is located in Qatar and comprised a ground investigation for a new port, which would involve major excavations and the reuse, where possible, of the excavated material. As you can see, there is no exposure and the site is covered by superficial deposits. There was no EGM of the site prior to starting the ground investigation. The site is located on Holocene Sabkha deposits. These are coastal supertidal deposits in which evaporite and saline materials accumulate as a result of the semi-arid to arid climate. The solid geology comprises dolomite and limestone of Upper Dammam Formation of Eocene age. The initial boreholes encountered either moderately weak to strong, thickly laminated limestone with typically very close to close subhorizontal joints, or moderately weak, pinkish grey, moderately to widely jointed limestone with small solution pockets which have subsequently been infilled. However, significant areas were underlain by essentially brecciated rock, which were essentially unforeseen. In order to understand the origin and possible extent of these materials, a conceptual model was then developed. This slide shows a visualization of the conceptual model in temporal terms. Solid geology was laid down in the Eocene and comprised massive limestones overlaid by laminated limestones. In the Middle Pleistocene, there was considerable uplift and the development of karst, including caverns and associated roof collapse. From about 6,000 years BP, the sea level rose, resulting in basal gravel and the Sabkha. Intense weathering resulted in much of the laminated limestone weathering to a gravel and carbonate siltstone infilling the karst voids. This shows the location of the three key rock types within the conceptual model. The second case study is related to landslides in Hong Kong. In 1995, two major landslides occurred, both of which resulted in fatalities. Both sites were associated with the presence of low-strength kaolin-rich zones. Kaolin was known to occur in Hong Kong, but was thought to be a scattered weathering product, or where concentrations did occur, these were actually related to hydrothermal alteration. Detailed studies were undertaken to evaluate the origin and geotechnical implications of the zones in order to better understand where they could occur. These comprised field mapping and depth studies of 7 study areas, together with clay mineralogy and shear strength testing from 6 different sites. The study showed that virtually all samples have multiple deformations with shearing, brecciation, and folding of the kaolin. There were multiple kaolin infill generations associated with the weathering cycle and syn depositional slope movements associated with that. These movements create environments for further deposition. The movements also result in the development of residual strength. As part of the final report, a generic conceptual model was published to help communicate the findings to the wider geotechnical community. Conceptual model was developed for the rock engineering aspects of a proposed cavern site at Sha Tin, Hong Kong. The purpose of the caverns will be to allow the relocation of a nearby sewage treatment works underground. This model was developed for tender purposes at pre-feasibility stage, so there was no site-specific ground investigation. The models are based on the published geological maps and memoirs and an interpretation of a 1 to 5,000 scale digital elevation model. The focus was on evidence for structural control, and the models also incorporated experience and knowledge. This allowed a regional conceptual model to be generated to show the relationship of the site to the major faults, in particular that to the northwest of the site, the Tolo Channel Fault. A site-specific model was then developed, built using knowledge and experience of similar ground conditions. For each engineering geological unit defined, initial geotechnical parameters were proposed. It was assumed that weathering would be less than 30 meters, possibly except where faults are intercepted. It was assumed that no major or moderate faults would be present, although minor faults would be likely to be encountered with a geological strength index of 10 to 30 suggested. The sheeting joints were assumed to be less than 30-meter depth, with effective friction angles of 42 degrees and a JRC joint roughness coefficient of 10 to 20. The steeply dipping primary joints, a friction angle of 40 degrees was assumed, with a joint roughness coefficient of 5 to 10. Overall, it was assumed that the rock would have a strength of between 100 and 250 megapascals, block dimensions of 0.1 to 2 meters with an average of 0.5, and a range of GSI, Q, and RMR were proposed. Again, visualizations are not a conceptual model, they're just part of it. The conceptual model is also supported by documentation, including tables such as this, where the engineering significance and rock mass behavior for each engineering geological unit are discussed. A key part of any conceptual model are uncertainty statements, identifying what is known and suggesting how this uncertainty can be reduced. For example, with respect to faults at this site, it states, carry out site-specific air photograph and LiDAR interpretations to identify all possible lineaments, carry out a site reconnaissance, followed by carefully planned and targeted field mapping, and then ground investigation, preferably involving several stages of investigations, with the observational model being constantly updated.
So, in summary, conceptualization and the resulting models are associated with uncertainty. The uncertainty is abstract. It relates to whether or not the concepts that have been identified are the most reasonable set of concepts, i.e. they are dependent upon knowledge and experience. The most problematic models are those made inadvertently, where knowledge and experience is lacking. However, a good conceptual model should be capable of anticipating most of the engineering geological issues that could potentially affect the project. Conceptualization allows the generation of an initial geological model that can be used to plan the site investigation, which should be focused on the ground characteristics that are critical for design and reducing uncertainty in the model. It also allows geotechnical parameters to be attributed to parts of the conceptual model, for example, soil and rock strength, stiffness, permeability, geomorphological process rates, etc. Finally, the model allows the evaluation of potential geotechnical risks and possible project opportunities that require assessment.
Thank you very much, Steve, for that. I would like to ask you to turn on the camera, also you, Fred, if you're still here. I don't know if there are any questions from the participants regarding the last presentation, or if there is any discussion that you would like to start in general regarding the engineering geological models. We'll be happy. Let's start with one question. Conceptual model was frequently used as a working hypothesis for site investigation. Can you address this issue more or give some examples?
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to get over with those three different sort of case studies, where the conceptual model is used and how it can really help the ground investigation. I mean, the classic statement is, if you don't know much about a site, you're not going to find much of value if you carry out a ground investigation. You've got to go into planning your ground investigation with questions. You've got to know what may be there, what are the risks, what are the uncertainties. So this is where the conceptual model is fundamentally important. It gives you a list of questions that and allows you to design the ground investigation most appropriately.
I see that. Let's go to, until we have a next question. One question that we had during your talk is regarding Fred's talk. So the landslide mechanism is also assumption. The participant wondered if begging stages of engineering geological models are deferred with following or final stages. Would it be problematic to the owner of the development?
Sorry, I don't understand the question.
So it says like the beginning stages of engineering geological models are different from the final stages. Is this problematic to the owner of the development or the boss of the?
I think what we're talking about here is how the engineering geological model of any project develops with time, and it's absolutely essential that everybody appreciates that what you start off thinking might be there is going to change as you collect further information. I think that what the issue is about here is is communicating with the owner what you might be thinking about at any one stage in the project, and being completely open with the idea that this is going to change. You can't sort these things out right at the beginning. You've got to take everybody on a journey where you're involved in the development of this knowledge framework, and you're using it to manage the risks on the project.
They should be adaptable. That's also written, I think, in the guidelines.
Yep.
So next question for Steve is how the unknown or the unpredictable can be considered in engineering geological models?
I think that the fundamental thing that we keep emphasizing in the guidelines is basically at conceptual stage, what happens is typically in a consultant in the UK or anywhere else in the world, there's a desk study carried out, and that's usually given to the graduate, the youngest guy that knows, or girl who knows possibly very little, and they carry out the desk study. They pull all this information together, it's put into a document and it's presented. Here's the information. But there's no conceptualization of that data, and that's the problem. And to conceptualize the data, it requires knowledge and experience. It's not a thing, I mean, a graduate can have a go at, and the whole point of our profession is we mentor graduates. But if you don't have the knowledge and experience, it's very difficult then to extrapolate what the possible ground conditions on the site may be. I mean, the example in Qatar, for example, there was no model on the site. I was just dragged in, can you go and supervise this site investigation? So I get on a plane, I go out there, and they're drilling wigs and they're pulling out the limestone, and it all looks fine. Then all of a sudden we get this fractured ground and everybody's going, oh, what's that? And then you think, well, it's limestone. You're going to have karst, you're going to have weathering. And off the site, not 20 k's away, there are collapsed cave systems. So it's not unforeseeable. It should have been foreseen. So that was the whole point. Okay, let's explain to the engineers how this could develop. And once they got the nice little pictures, okay, we should have known about that. So it's about taking the data, taking knowledge and experience, and then extrapolating. I'm not saying we're going to get it 100% right. We'll always get surprises about something we might miss, but we can greatly reduce the uncertainty if we've got a conceptual model that's based on a good desk study, knowledge and experience.
Exactly, I completely agree with it.
If I could just add to that.
Yeah, sure.
The way that conceptual models can be presented as easily understood drawings, usually nicely colored, is fundamentally the way that they can be communicated to engineers and clients. You can show them a picture of what it might be like, and they can then understand the engineering implications of it. So this use of graphics and plans and sections and these beautiful little models is really an essential part of the process of communication.
And I think it's really important how you communicate that, and it's very, very important. Next question, dear Mr. Parry, as you emphasized that conceptual models are not engineering geological models, but can we say that conceptual model is an integrated product of engineering geological model and risks? Is it possible that the risk may be different when considering different factors such as an earthquake or a typhoon?
The conceptual model is an integrated product of the EGM. It's the starting point of the EGM, and it provides this feedback loop for observation models. When you get the data, does that tie with the conceptual model you have? And if it doesn't, what's wrong? Is there something wrong with the data, or is there something wrong with conceptual models? You've got this feedback loop that's running. But yes, the risk and the hazards will differ depending on the project type, obviously, and project location and the ground conditions. Every project is unique. So you've got to take into account all these different factors on each site to allow you to generate A, the conceptual model, and then B, the risks. For example, at the Baildon one, we went through multiple types of hazards, for everything from aggressive ground conditions through to coal mine collapse, landsliding, and so on and so forth. So all the different factors are there, and then they're evaluated against the project. And then again, it provides a framework then for the ground investigation to assess whether these are real risks to the project on that particular site.
I don't see any question from the participant. I would like here to emphasize that this is like Stephen Fred gave us like some insights on the outcome from C25. This is an ongoing process, and this is something that is also going to be promoted from the e-YEG in the future. So I would like all of the participants to stay connected with the e-YEG, and if there are any more questions or anything that you would like to discuss, I think Steve and Fred are always welcome to have any insights in that. I would like to thank you, both of you, Steve and Fred, for your contributions to the e-YEG webinars. It was really valuable, I think, for all of our participants and for the Young Engineering Committee to have you here and present the outcome. If you would like anything to say, please feel free.
I'd just like to thank you, Stratis, for having, well, and your group for having organised this event and given us the opportunity to present on these things. And I would just like to stress that this is an ongoing project. Steve and I are committed to improving these guidelines. We think that they're so important, and we really do need the inputs from anybody who is interested to continue to be involved in developing these guidelines.
Yeah, and we should outline, Fred, that this is not like a 2 or 3 year process, right? Like it has been many years that you started doing that, you took the feedback from many people, so it's not an easy task, right?
Well, and also, I think that it's important. As you can see, Steve and I are elderly. What we actually need are younger people to become involved to continue this process.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think we can have, our scope is to have also some on-site presentation for people that they're going to be interested in that. It's really valuable for many regions to have some on-site presentations from you or some colleagues on that. It's an ongoing process, so there's going to be, definitely there are some limitations, but there are plenty of advantages that most of the people can take on. So once again, thank you all for being a part of it. Thank all participants for being here today.
So just one more question just popped up. I was just going to answer, somebody said, slightly off topic, but do you think it's important for young graduates to take a first stab at developing models? Yes, it's the only way you learn. Have a go, but have somebody there, a mentor, a colleague, whoever you're doing your training with. Have a go yourself, pass it to them, get the feedback, and continually try. The only way you get good at this is by continually practicing it.
Exactly. Yeah, it's experience and knowledge has to combination of it, right? Yeah, you're right. Completely. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That was a pleasure to host you here, and to all our participants, stay connected. We're going to have more topics, and thank you once again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.